For Christians, the death of Jesus is the necessary sacrifice for the remission of sins. For Jews, Jesus is not seen as the Messiah or the Son of God, and his death has no redemptive meaning. Instead, it is considered the execution of a Jewish man by the Roman Empire. The religious leaders of the time saw Jesus as a threat because his message challenged traditions, questioned authorities, and attracted followers. Moreover, the Jews expected the Messiah to be a political and military leader who would liberate Israel from Roman rule, something Jesus never sought to be. As a result, his preaching and growing influence led the Jewish authorities to see him as a danger, leading them to hand him over to the Romans to be judged and executed. To truly understand why Jesus had to die, we must go far beyond Jerusalem, beyond Rome, beyond even the traditions of the Old Testament. We must look to the forgotten gods of Canaan, Mesopotamia, and the ancient world, who once ruled over humanity. Gods who, over millennia, were either erased, merged, or transformed into the monotheistic framework that dominated Jesus' time. This is the Anunnaki Connection to understand why Jesus had to die. Long before the worship of a single God, before the dominance of Yahweh and the rise of monotheism, the Near East was a land where gods walked among men, shaping civilizations, granting power to kings, and waging wars that echoed in the heavens and on earth. These gods, known by many names across cultures, were not mere spiritual concepts, but living entities, flesh and bone beings revered by those who claimed to have witnessed their power firsthand. In the earliest days of recorded history, the lands that would later be home to the Hebrews, Canaanites, and other Semitic peoples were dominated by the civilizations of Sumer and Akkad. The Sumerians, the first builders of cities, recorded their history through cuneiform texts that tell of their rulers and the gods who walked among them. These gods, known as the Anunnaki, were said to have descended from the heavens, taking up residence in grand temples, ruling over humanity and bestowing wisdom upon chosen kings. As Mesopotamian civilization expanded, so too did the reach of its deities, and with expansion came reinterpretation. The gods of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon were not confined to their original cities but spread throughout the Near East, changing names and roles as they were adopted by new cultures. The Sumerian storm god Ishkur became the Akkadian Adad, the Canaanite Hadad, and eventually the mighty Baal of the Phoenicians and early Israelites. Likewise, the moon god Nannar, known later as Sin, was not just the patron deity of Ur, but was worshipped far beyond Mesopotamia, spreading into Haran and other major religious centers. These shifts were not arbitrary. They reflected the movement of people, trade, and political influence, as well as the cosmic struggles between divine factions that played out on Earth. The biblical narrative of Abraham hints at this transition from the old Mesopotamian religious order to the emerging Hebrew monotheism. According to Genesis, Terah, the father of Abraham, was originally from Ur, a city devoted to sin. When Yahweh commanded Terah to leave, his family did not initially travel to an entirely foreign land, but to Haran, another major center of moon worship. This raises important questions about the religious transition of Abraham's lineage. Was Abraham himself originally a follower of sin before he encountered Yahweh? Was the shift from the moon god's dominion to Yahweh's rule part of a greater spiritual conquest? If so, the monotheistic tradition of Israel did not emerge from nothing. It was shaped by the struggle between gods who had ruled the region long before. This idea is reinforced by ancient territorial and religious conflicts. Archaeological discoveries in Israel suggest that long before Abraham, long before the Israelites, this land was already home to a different spiritual order. A massive crescent-shaped stone monument, dating between 3050 and 2650 BCE, was recently discovered near the Sea of Galilee. Initially mistaken for part of a city wall, researchers realized that it was in fact a standalone structure with no associated city, built during an era that predates both Abraham and the Israelites. The shape of the monument, a crescent, is strongly associated with the worship of the moon god Sin. This suggests that the region now known as Israel was once under Sin's spiritual dominion, before Yahweh took possession of it in later biblical tradition. This transition is deeply embedded in the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, where the Old Testament describes how Yahweh divided the nations of the earth after the Tower of Babel. According to Deuteronomy, when humanity was scattered, the gods, referred to as the sons of God, were assigned different regions. Yahweh did not originally claim Israel. It was only after Abraham that this land became Yahweh's portion. This implies that before Yahweh established his rule, this land belonged to another god, likely Sin, who had been considered the supreme deity by those who built the ancient crescent monument and worshipped him in Ur and Haran. The importance of Sin's cult cannot be overstated. In Mesopotamian and Akkadian tradition, Sin was revered as the Lord of the gods and the God of gods. His influence was so widespread that even in later Aramaic traditions, he was still called Marilahe, meaning Lord of the gods. Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon before its fall to Persia, sought to restore Sin's dominance, giving him grand epithets and attempting to re-establish his cult in Haran. This historical struggle for religious supremacy mirrors what may have happened much earlier, during the time of Abraham, when the transition from Mesopotamian moon worship to Yahweh's exclusive rule first began. Just as Marduk overthrew Enlil in Babylon, Yahweh's rise in Israel was not an isolated event, but part of a much older struggle among the gods. Before monotheism took root, early Hebrews practiced monolatry, the exclusive worship of one God without denying the existence of others. This is evident in biblical texts, where Yahweh is depicted not as the only God, but as the most powerful among many. The first commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me," does not deny the existence of rival deities, but instead asserts Yahweh's supremacy over them. This reflects an earlier stage of Yahweh's worship, where he had to compete with other gods for dominance. His transformation into the sole divine authority was a long, deliberate process, carried out by rulers and priests who sought to consolidate religious power. Yahweh's rise mirrored the ascension of Marduk in Babylon, where he gradually supplanted older gods like Enlil and declared himself the undisputed ruler of the heavens. Just as Marduk's priests rewrote Babylonian mythology to place him at the center, the Israelite prophets and scribes erased or diminished rival gods from their religious landscape. Baal, once a great storm deity, became a false god condemned in the scriptures. Asherah, once venerated as a mother goddess, was written out of religious history, her sacred groves destroyed. The process was not just a theological shift. It was a systematic religious war, a deliberate reshaping of divine history. The transformation of Yahweh into the one true God of Israel was not simply a natural evolution of faith. It was a conquest, a deliberate reordering of spiritual dominion in which older gods were dethroned, demonized, or forgotten. And if this is true, then monotheism itself was not a revelation, but a reconstruction of divine hierarchy, an ideological victory rather than a divine truth. Yahweh's claim over Israel was not the birth of a new religious order, but the continuation of an ancient battle, one that had begun in Mesopotamia, shaped the Hebrew faith, and set the stage for the eventual confrontation between Jesus and the priesthood that upheld Yahweh's exclusive rule. The question remains, was Abraham's encounter with Yahweh truly the beginning of something new, Or was it the final stage of an unseen war that had been waged in the heavens and on earth for thousands of years? The intent of this exploration is not to conclude the discussion, but to lay the foundation for understanding Jesus within the vast religious evolution of the Near East. To understand Jesus fully, one must first understand the gods that came before him, the belief systems that shaped the world he lived in, and the long history of divine rulers, prophets, and rebels who fought for the fate of mankind. Future explorations will delve deeper into the transitions between these gods, the forces that shaped religious thought, and how the battle between control and enlightenment remains relevant even today. As monotheism took root, the priesthood actively worked to erase Yahweh's rivals. Baal's altars were destroyed, Asherah's groves were burned, and older gods were demonized. This transition was not just a theological shift, but a deliberate religious war, one that would define the power structures of Israel for centuries to come. The Sadducees and Pharisees, the religious elite who later dominated Jewish law, were the inheritors of this strategy. The temple became the center of religious authority, and its rituals, sacrifices, and laws defined the structure of Jewish life. But not everyone accepted this enforced monotheism. The prophets, those enigmatic figures who spoke in the name of a higher truth, often clashed with the priests, challenging the rigid structures of organized worship, advocating instead for a direct connection to the divine, one that transcended the laws and rituals imposed by the temple elite. Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal was not just about proving Yahweh's superiority. It was a turning point in the war for religious dominance. The fiery demonstration on Mount Carmel, where Yahweh's fire consumed the altar while Baal's remained silent, was a public execution of the old gods, a moment designed to cement Yahweh's rule and eliminate all traces of competing spiritual paths. Yet, even as monotheism took hold, divisions within Jewish society deepened, leading to a fractured and volatile religious landscape by the time of Jesus. By the 4th century BCE, this religious war entered a new phase with the arrival of Alexander the Great. His conquest was not just military, it was ideological, bringing Greek philosophy, governance, and religious thought into every corner of his empire. Judea, once a remote province of the Persian Empire, was now thrust into the center of an unprecedented cultural transformation. Greek temples rose beside Hebrew sanctuaries. Jewish communities debated the merits of Greek rationalism, and Hellenistic ideas seeped into Jewish religious thought. The impact of this shift was immediate and irreversible. Judaism itself was forced to redefine its identity, caught between the growing power of monotheism and the intellectual allure of Hellenistic philosophy. But Alexander was more than a conqueror. He saw himself as a divine figure, a ruler ordained by the gods. In Egypt, he was welcomed not just as a king, but as the son of Amun-Ra, a deity deeply connected to the Mesopotamian gods of old. His ambition went beyond empire building. He sought to integrate the sacred kingship of the past into his rule. Yet, when he arrived in Babylon in 331 BCE, he encountered something that shook the foundations of this vision. Marduk was dead. The Esagila temple, once the heart of Babylonian worship, lay in decline. The god who had once granted kingship to the rulers of Mesopotamia was no longer present. This moment was more than symbolic. It signified the end of an era. The divine order that had ruled for thousands of years had vanished, replaced by a new system of centralized power that no longer relied on the old gods. If Marduk was gone, was it because he had been defeated? Had the divine war that had begun in the ancient past reached its final resolution? His plans to restore Babylon as the capital of his empire never materialized. Within a few years, Alexander was dead, his mysterious passing fueling speculation that forces beyond human politics had ensured the old gods would never rise again. With his death, Babylon's decline accelerated, and its influence as a religious center faded. In the years that followed, the great shift of power moved westward to Rome. This was more than just a political transition. It was the final suppression of Marduk's influence, replaced by the authority of Zeus and Jupiter, gods whose hierarchical structure mirrored that of Enlil. From this point forward, kings no longer ruled as earthly representatives of walking gods. Instead, empires established themselves as divine institutions, enforcing their control through law, governance, and an ever-strengthening priesthood. With Babylon no longer the center of culture, Greek philosophy became the dominant intellectual force in the region. Some Jewish scholars, like Philo of Alexandria, sought to merge Platonic ideas with Jewish theology, giving rise to Hellenistic Judaism, a fusion of Greek rationalism and monotheistic tradition that reshaped religious thought for centuries. But not all Jews embraced this fusion of traditions. Many saw Hellenism as an existential threat to Jewish identity, an intrusion that sought to erode their faith and replace it with foreign gods and customs. The tension reached its breaking point in 167 BCE, when the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes took extreme measures to enforce Greek religious practices in Judea. He banned Jewish rituals, outlawed circumcision, and placed a statue of Zeus in the Holy Temple of Jerusalem. This act of sacrilege triggered the Maccabean Revolt, a violent uprising in which Jewish rebels, led by the Hasmonean family, reclaimed the temple, removed the Greek influences, and restored the exclusive worship of Yahweh alone. Their victory led to the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, a brief period of Jewish independence in which the struggle between faith and political power continued to shape the nation. Even after their victory, the Hasmoneans found themselves torn between tradition and necessity. Some rulers adopted aspects of Hellenistic governance to maintain alliances, while others adhered strictly to Jewish law. Their internal divisions weakened them, and in 63 BCE, the Romans seized control of Judea, bringing an end to Jewish sovereignty once again. With Rome's arrival, the forces of empire, centralization, and priestly control took full dominance, setting the stage for the ultimate religious conflict, the one that would culminate in the execution of Jesus of Nazareth. By Jesus' time, Jewish society was deeply fractured. The Sadducees, the temple elite, were closely aligned with Rome, ensuring that the temple remained the religious and economic center of Judea while securing their own privileged status. The Pharisees, though more focused on Jewish law, had developed an increasingly rigid interpretation of religious practice, enforcing strict legalism. But beyond these dominant factions, there were those who rejected both political compromise and religious rigidity. The Essenes, an enigmatic sect that had retreated into the wilderness, carried on a tradition far older than mainstream Judaism. Some scholars believe they preserved esoteric teachings, remnants of ancient wisdom that predated Yahweh's exclusive rule. Their writings, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, prophesied the coming of a teacher of righteousness, one who would challenge the corruption of the temple priests and restore a lost spiritual truth. Many historians see parallels between Jesus' teachings and the beliefs of the Essenes. Like them, he rejected the authority of the temple elite, emphasizing direct communion with the divine over rigid law. His message of a kingdom beyond this world was a direct challenge to both the priesthood and the Roman occupation. In many ways, his mission echoed that of the Maccabees, who had resisted Hellenistic rule. But whereas they fought with swords, Jesus waged war with words, undermining the power structures not through rebellion, but through revelation. This made him dangerous. He did not just oppose the corrupt religious establishment, he opposed the very system of divine rule that had been shaping human history since the days of Mesopotamia. His teachings did not align with Enlil's authoritarian laws, nor did they serve the interests of the Roman imperial model. Instead, they pointed toward something older, an ancient knowledge that had long been buried, a connection between humanity and the divine that had been systematically erased. Was Jesus' mission an attempt to restore a forgotten spiritual truth, one that predated the strict laws of Yahweh, the rule of Zeus and Jupiter, and the empires that had sought to control the destiny of mankind? If so, then his execution was not merely a political necessity. It was the final act in a war that had begun not in Judea, but in Sumer, in Babylon, and in the hidden histories of the gods themselves. In the ancient traditions of Sumer and Akkad, the gods who shaped humanity were divided into two opposing factions. On one side stood Enlil, the supreme ruler of the Anunnaki, a god of order, law, and absolute authority. He decreed the fate of mankind, enforcing strict obedience through commandments and punishments. His presence in Mesopotamian mythology bears a striking resemblance to Yahweh of the Torah, a deity who demanded total loyalty, issued severe laws, and punished disobedience. The flood narratives of the Hebrew Bible, in which Yahweh decides to wipe out humanity, parallel Sumerian and Akkadian texts describing Enlil's decision to destroy humans for their increasing numbers and disobedience. Yahweh's emphasis on strict rituals, sacrifice, and unwavering worship mirrors the Enlilite ideology, which centralized divine authority to prevent humans from gaining too much autonomy. Yet, there was another force at play in these ancient myths, one that opposed Enlil's rule. This was Enki, the bringer of wisdom and knowledge, who defied Enlil and saved humanity from destruction. While Enlil sought control, Enki offered enlightenment and liberation. According to Mesopotamian texts, Enki warned Zusudra, the Sumerian Noah, of the impending flood, ensuring the survival of humanity despite Enlil's decree. Often depicted as a teacher, trickster, and protector of mankind, Enki worked in secret to pass down knowledge that could free humanity from divine oppression. As history unfolded, the echoes of this cosmic struggle remained embedded in human spirituality. By the time Jesus emerged, this war had reached a critical moment. His teachings represented a direct challenge to the Enlilite system that had dominated religious thought for centuries. His message of personal connection to God, mercy over sacrifice, and liberation from rigid laws was an explicit rejection of the hierarchical structure maintained by temple priesthoods. Within his words, one can see clear echoes of Enki's influence, an emphasis on hidden knowledge, inner transformation, and a divine order independent of institutional mediation. In biblical tradition, Jesus is referred to as the Son of God, a title interpreted both metaphorically and literally. From a broader perspective, this designation could indicate more than a spiritual role. It could signify a biological connection to celestial beings, particularly those associated with wisdom, knowledge, and human advancement. Ancient rulers, particularly in Mesopotamia and Egypt, often claimed divine ancestry, tracing their lineage back to the gods. The Hebrew Bible contains numerous accounts of divine intervention in human bloodlines, from the Nephilim of Genesis to the genealogies of kings and prophets. The possibility that Jesus carried a direct celestial genetic inheritance aligns with this motif, explaining his extraordinary wisdom, healing abilities, and profound impact on human consciousness. Considering the New Testament accounts of Jesus' transfiguration, resurrection, and ascension, these events take on a different dimension when viewed through this lens. His ability to heal the sick, perform miracles, and transcend death could suggest an advanced genetic composition, possibly influenced by a superior lineage. His ascension, described as a bodily return to the heavens, resembles accounts of gods or celestial beings departing Earth in radiant forms, hinting at a deeper understanding of interdimensional or extraterrestrial travel. The nature of Jesus' teachings further raises intriguing questions about his connection to the divine factions of antiquity. The Old Testament, often associated with a God of order, control, and strict laws, contrasts sharply with Jesus' message of love, forgiveness, and enlightenment. His teachings suggest an alignment with Enki's ideology, advocating for the empowerment and liberation of humanity rather than submission to authoritarian structures. The cross, one of the most ancient and universally recognized symbols in human history, further deepens this connection. Traditionally associated with Jesus' crucifixion, its origins stretch far beyond Christianity, suggesting a significance rooted in something far older. Some alternative views propose that the cross may be linked to ancient extraterrestrial or divine influences, particularly the Anunnaki. The cross appears on various cylinder seals. Additionally, the Maltese cross is a symbol of Anu, the father who is in the heavens, the father of Enki and Enlil. The name Anu itself meant sky and was the personification of the heavens. The symbol of the Maltese cross, the symbol of Anu, is closely linked to Christianity. Throughout Mesopotamian iconography, various forms of the cross appear in temple carvings, cylinder seals, and depictions of divine beings. One of the most prominent Anunnaki symbols is the winged disc, often shown with cross-like elements extending outward. This emblem, associated with celestial authority and dominion over Earth, was frequently linked to high-ranking deities. The cross-like symbols in these depictions suggest that the cross, as a sacred emblem, may have originated from knowledge passed down by these advanced beings. Similar symbols appear across the ancient world. In Egypt, the Ankh, or key of life, resembles the cross with its looped top signifying eternal life and divine wisdom. Frequently held by gods and pharaohs, the Ankh reinforced the ruler's divine connection. In pre-Columbian civilizations, such as the Maya and Aztecs, the cross was also significant. The Mayan sacred cross, often depicted in temple carvings, was associated with the tree of life and the center of creation, an idea strikingly similar to Mesopotamian beliefs about the divine connection between heaven and earth. In Aztec mythology, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity linked to wisdom and knowledge, was sometimes depicted with cross-shaped symbols. The presence of this emblem in civilizations with no known contact suggests an ancient and possibly extraterrestrial origin. Throughout history, celestial events have been interpreted as signs from the gods, and the cross may be one such marker of an astronomical phenomenon that signaled the return or influence of the Anunnaki. And so, perhaps at that time in Bethlehem, a star that moved with an unparalleled brilliance appeared at the very hour, on the very day, and in the very place where Jesus was born. Throughout history, the struggle between authoritarian rule and spiritual liberation has played out repeatedly, manifesting in different civilizations and eras. The time of Jesus was no exception, unfolding under the dominance of the Roman Empire, an entity exemplifying control, order, and strict hierarchy. Rome's oppressive rule mirrored an older cosmic conflict between factions that had long influenced the fate of humanity. One ideology sought to control humanity through laws, rigid societal structures, and absolute obedience, while the other aimed to uplift and enlighten humankind, granting knowledge and free will. Jesus emerged as a radical figure within this oppressive system, challenging its foundations. His teachings emphasized love, forgiveness, and direct communion with the divine, standing in stark contrast to the authoritarian rule imposed by Rome and the religious elites who served its interests. His conflict was not merely against Roman occupation, but against an ideology that sought to suppress the divine spark within humanity. Roman governance was deeply intertwined with spiritual control. Emperors claimed divine authority, temples were dedicated to ruler worship, and religious institutions served political agendas. This mirrored the priest kings of Mesopotamia, who ruled with the belief that their power was granted by the gods. In contrast, Jesus spoke of a kingdom beyond earthly rulers, challenging the notion that emperors or priestly authorities were necessary mediators between humanity and the divine. The trial of Jesus was carefully orchestrated, a calculated move by the religious elite who saw him as an existential threat. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish council of high priests, accused him of blasphemy, not because of any moral failing, but because he undermined the necessity of the temple system and the religious hierarchy they controlled. He preached direct access to God, without the need for priests, rituals, or sacrifices, a doctrine inherently dangerous to those who had built their power upon enforcing strict adherence to religious law. The priesthood had long functioned as intermediaries between God and the people, much like the ancient Mesopotamian priest kings who claimed their authority from the Anunnaki. Jesus rejected this entire structure, placing him in direct opposition to the Enlilite order that had governed humanity for thousands of years. However, the Jewish priests did not have the power to execute him alone. They needed the authority of the Roman Empire, which had established its dominance over Judea, ensuring that any perceived revolutionary or disruptor of order would be swiftly dealt with. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, was not personally invested in Jewish theological disputes, but understood the political ramifications of allowing a man like Jesus to continue spreading his teachings. To Rome, Jesus represented instability. His ideas were dangerous because they did not fit into the imperial model of control. If people no longer believed they needed high priests or rulers to govern their relationship with God, the very foundations of the Roman world would begin to crack. And so, Jesus was sentenced to death, not just as a religious heretic, but as an enemy of the state, of empire, of the divine hierarchy that had ruled since the days of Sumer. His crucifixion was a ritualized execution, a symbolic demonstration that the system could not be challenged without consequence. Yet the forces at play went beyond human politics. Was Jesus' execution merely a moment in history, or was it the fulfillment of a larger cosmic agenda? Did the ruling powers of his time act on their own accord, or were they simply pawns in an ongoing spiritual war, one that had been waged in secret by the Enlilite forces who had long sought to dominate humanity? If Jesus' message represented the resurgence of Enkiite wisdom, then his death was the final victory of Enlil's system over the earth. But the true triumph of the Enlilite order was not in the killing of Jesus. It was in what followed. His death did not end his movement. It transformed it into something else entirely. Over the following centuries, the teachings of Jesus were repurposed, restructured, and institutionalized into a religion that, instead of liberating humanity, reinforced the very power structures he had sought to dismantle. When Constantine the Great declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century CE, it was not a victory for Jesus' message. It was a reconstruction of his teachings to fit within the existing Enlilite framework. The Roman Church became the spiritual extension of the empire, consolidating power under a single, centralized authority. The Pope became the new high priest, mirroring the same hierarchical structures that had governed ancient Mesopotamian temple rule. The Christian Church, instead of rejecting political power as Jesus had, became intertwined with it, enforcing doctrines that maintained imperial order rather than spiritual liberation. In 325 CE, the Council of Nicaea solidified this transformation. Alternative Christian sects, such as the Gnostics, the Arians, and the remnants of Essene traditions, were labeled as heretical and systematically eliminated. These groups, which carried elements of hidden esoteric knowledge, were a direct threat to the Church's authority. The Gnostics, in particular, held beliefs that were strikingly Enkiite in nature. They spoke of divine knowledge, the illusion of earthly authority, and the potential for humans to access the divine directly. Their teachings did not require a church, a pope, or an imperial structure, making them enemies of the newly established Christian order. From this point onward, mysticism, independent spiritual thought, and alternative interpretations of Jesus' message were hunted down and suppressed. The Inquisition, the persecution of the Cathars, the suppression of Kabbalistic traditions, and the destruction of Gnostic texts were all part of a larger effort to erase the remnants of Enkiite wisdom. What remained was a version of Christianity that had been reconstructed to serve the Enlilite system, a system of control, obedience, and hierarchy. Yet, something else happened, something unexpected. Though the Enlilite order triumphed on the surface, remnants of Jesus' teachings did not disappear. Like the secret wisdom that had been suppressed before, his message survived in the hidden corners of history. The Gnostics, the Essenes, the Kabbalists, and other esoteric traditions preserved pieces of a far older truth, a truth that, if fully understood, could once again break the cycle of spiritual control that has held humanity captive for millennia. Ancient texts and sacred writings across different cultures speak of gods who departed but promised to return at the appointed time. The concept of a second coming or a great renewal is not unique to Christianity, but can be found in Sumerian, Egyptian, Mesoamerican, and Hindu traditions. If Jesus was indeed connected to these ancient traditions, his role may have been greater than typically understood. His teachings may have been designed to prepare people for a reality far greater than what they had been led to believe. A reality where the return of the gods is not just a metaphor, but a tangible event awaiting its destined moment in history. And one of the main questions we should ask ourselves about the promise of the gods' return is, when the Anunnaki return, who will be in power? And we'll cover this topic in a future video. See you in the next video.